They called it the Silent Reaper, the weapon that made grown men believe in ghosts, the rifle that turned the Afghan mountains into a graveyard where death arrived without warning, without sound, without mercy. What you're about to witness isn't just another war story. This is the classified nightmare that kept Taliban commanders awake at night. The weapon system so terrifying that enemy fighters refused orders, abandoned their posts, and executed their own men out of sheer paranoia. The SR-25. You've never heard of it, have you? That's exactly how the Australian Special Air Service Regiment wanted it. While the world obsessed over Navy SEALs and Delta Force, these bearded madmen were conducting a campaign of psychological warfare so brutal, so precise, that it rewrote the rules of modern combat. 800 confirmed kills, 18-day operations living in absolute filth, shots through solid walls at targets they could only see as heat signatures, Taliban fighters dropping one after another with no idea where death was coming from, entire cells paralyzed by fear of an enemy they couldn't see, couldn't hear, couldn't fight. But here's what nobody talks about. Here's the part that got buried in classified reports and psychological evaluations. The men who wielded this weapon paid a price that goes far beyond any official casualty count. What happens to a human being when you turn them into a precision killing machine? When you ask them to watch targets for hours, then methodically erase them from existence, one after another, day after day, week after week. The Americans were shocked. The British were disturbed. The Taliban were convinced they were fighting supernatural forces. And the Australian operators who pulled those triggers, some of them are still trying to figure out how to live with what they became. This is the story they don't want you to know. The weapon that terrified an entire insurgency. The psychological toll that nobody calculated. The strategic victory that came with a hidden cost. Stay with me until the end, because what you're about to discover will change everything you thought you knew about modern warfare. The silent marksmanship campaign that haunts Afghanistan to this very day starts right now. The first body dropped at 0230 hours, and nobody heard a thing. An American Green Beret captain stationed at Forward Operating Base Anaconda in Uruzgan province watched through his night vision goggles as a Taliban commander simply collapsed mid-sentence while addressing his fighters in a walled compound 800 meters away. No explosion, no tracers streaking through the darkness, no warning whatsoever. The man's skull opened like a split melon, spraying the dirt wall behind him with brain matter, and his companions didn't even flinch because they hadn't registered what happened yet. 3 seconds later, the man standing next to him went down the same way. Then another, then 2 more in rapid succession. The Green Beret keyed his radio with trembling fingers, his voice barely steady as he whispered into the comms. "They've got ghosts out there. I'm watching targets drop and I can't see the shooter. I can't hear the shots. What the hell are we dealing with?" But this was only the beginning of what became the Taliban's worst nightmare in southern Afghanistan. The response came back cold and matter-of-fact from the Australian liaison officer embedded with his unit. "That's not ghosts, mate. That's our boys with the SR-25. Welcome to how we do business." What he witnessed that night in 2008 was the terror that kept Taliban fighters awake in their caves and compounds across Helmand, Kandahar, and Uruzgan provinces. The Australian Special Air Service Regiment had brought a weapon to Afghanistan that transformed sniping into surgical assassination. The SR-25 wasn't just a rifle. It was a declaration of absolute dominance over the battlefield. A tool that allowed bearded men in non-regulation gear to kill with such precision and silence that their enemies began to believe in supernatural intervention. The Stoner Rifle 25 emerged from Eugene Stoner's final design iteration before his passing in 1997, a scaling up of his legendary AR-15 platform to accommodate the hard-hitting 7.6 2x51 mm NATO cartridge. Built on the AR-10 framework, the rifle represented everything the Australian SASR loved about weapons design. It was accurate, reliable, powerful, and most importantly, fast. While American snipers still predominantly relied on bolt-action platforms like the M24 or the British-designed L96, which required manual cycling between shots, the SR-25 operated on a gas system that chambered the next round automatically. Yet what happened next would shock even the most experienced American operators. This mechanical difference sounds minor on paper, but on the battlefield, it created a chasm of capability that the Taliban learned to fear with religious intensity. A bolt-action sniper takes his shot, then must break his sight picture to manually work the bolt, ejecting the spent casing and loading a fresh round. During those critical 2 to 3 seconds, he's blind to his target's reaction. He's vulnerable. He's slow. The SR-25 eliminated this vulnerability entirely. The Australian shooter could fire, watch the target drop through his optic, acquire the next target, and fire again without ever moving his eye from the scope. The semi-automatic action meant that a skilled SASR marksman could deliver accurate fire at a rate that made enemies believe they were being engaged by multiple snipers simultaneously. The real horror, however, came from what the Australians attached to the muzzle. The Knight's Armament quick-detach suppressor transformed the rifle from merely deadly to absolutely terrifying. Measuring nearly 8 inches long and weighing close to 2 pounds, this cylindrical black tube didn't just reduce the sound signature of the rifle, it obliterated it. The massive NATO cartridge, which normally produced a sharp crack that could be heard for miles across the desert, became a sound roughly equivalent to someone slamming a car door in the distance. At ranges beyond 600 meters, that sound dissipated into the ambient noise of wind, animals, and the general chaos of an Afghan night. The suppressor also eliminated muzzle flash, that bright signature that gives away a shooter's position even in darkness. Taliban spotters trained to look for that telltale bloom of light would scan the ridgelines and see absolutely nothing. The SASR shooter would be invisible, inaudible, and utterly lethal. What the Americans witnessed next would fundamentally change how they understood modern warfare. American Special Operations Forces respected this capability, but they didn't fully understand its psychological impact until they started running joint operations with the Australian squadrons rotating through Regional Command South. A Navy SEAL platoon operating out of Kandahar Airfield in 2009 got their first real exposure to Australian silent marksmanship during a compound raid in Jari district. The target was a mid-level Taliban commander named Mullah Abdul Razak, a former Mujahideen fighter who'd eliminated Soviet soldiers in the 80s and had transitioned smoothly to targeting Americans in the new millennium. Intelligence indicated he was meeting with several sub-commanders to plan an attack on a coalition convoy route. The SEAL element planned a classic direct action raid, fast rope from helicopters, explosive breach on the main gate, overwhelming violence of action, and extract before the enemy could organize a response. But the Australian SASR liaison suggested an alternative approach that the Americans found almost insultingly simple. Why don't we just shoot them through the windows? The SEAL team leader, a veteran of multiple combat deployments to Iraq and Afghanistan, stared at the Australian sergeant like he'd suggested using a slingshot. The compound had thick mud brick walls, multiple buildings, and an unknown number of fighters. The intelligence pictures showed at least 8 military-age males on site. A single sniper element couldn't possibly neutralize that many targets before the survivors went to ground and called for reinforcements. But the demonstration that followed would haunt the SEAL team leader for years to come. The Australian sergeant just smiled that particular smile that SASR operators wore when they knew something you didn't. He was a scarecrow of a man, built like twisted wire, with a beard that would have gotten him court-martialed in any conventional unit. His gear looked like it had been assembled from a Mad Max film set, with mismatched pouches, Aboriginal flag patches, and a custom chest rig that held AK-47 magazines alongside his M4 rounds. "Trust me," he said. "Give us 30 minutes before you launch. We'll thin the herd for you." What the SEALs didn't know was that 2 SASR marksmen had already been in position for 14 hours. Lying in shallow scrapes, they dug into a hillside 1,200 meters from the target compound. They'd moved into position the previous night, carrying their SR-25s wrapped in burlap, their bodies covered in local dirt, their movements so slow and deliberate that they'd taken 6 hours to cover the final 500 meters to their hide site. When the operation kicked off at 0300 hours, the 2 Australians began their work with the kind of methodical patience that separated professionals from amateurs. The primary shooter had a clear line of sight into the main meeting room through a glassless window. His spotter, using a thermal optic, identified 8 heat signatures inside the building and 3 more in an adjacent structure. Then the killing started, and it looked nothing like combat the Americans had ever witnessed. The shooter's breathing slowed to almost nothing as he settled into his final pre-shot routine. The SR-25's bipod rested on a small sandbag they'd carried specifically for this purpose. His finger rested on the trigger with precisely 3 pounds of pressure, just shy of the 4-pound breakpoint. Through his Schmidt and Bender scope, magnified to 25 power, he could see Mullah Abdul Razak gesturing emphatically while speaking to his subordinates. The first round left the barrel at 2,700 feet per second. 175 grain Sierra Match King boat-tail hollow point that covered the 1,200 meters in roughly 1.4 seconds. The Taliban commander's head snapped back as if he'd been kicked by a horse, and he dropped out of the sniper's view instantly. The shooter's finger was already moving back to the trigger before Razak finished falling. The semi-automatic action of the SR-25 had chambered the next round with a mechanical efficiency that made follow-up shots feel inevitable rather than urgent. 2 seconds after the first shot, the second Taliban fighter dropped. Then the third, then the fourth. The remaining fighters in the room finally understood they were under attack, but they had no idea from which direction annihilation was arriving. The suppressed SR-25 produced no visible muzzle flash, and at that distance, the sound of the shots didn't reach the compound in any recognizable form. The survivors did what panicked men always do. They ran. What happened in the next 90 seconds would be replayed in classified briefings for the next decade. This was exactly what the Australian shooters had been waiting for. As the Taliban fighters burst from the building into the open courtyard, they became silhouettes against the lighter-colored ground, perfectly backlit for the thermal optics. The SASR marksmen began methodically servicing targets with the kind of rhythm that comes from thousands of hours of training. Shot, pause, shot, pause, shot. By the time the SEAL element fast-roped from their helicopters 3 minutes later, every fighting-age male in the compound was already down. The Australians had fired 23 rounds and achieved 23 hits. Not one Taliban fighter made it to a defensive position. Not one returned fire. Not one even figured out where the shooting was coming from. The SEAL team leader walked through the compound in stunned silence, stepping over bodies that were still warm, noting the precise head and upper chest shots that characterized surgical marksmanship. When he finally made radio contact with the Australian hide site, his voice carried a mixture of professional respect and genuine unease. "How many shooters did you have up there?" "Just the two of us," the Australian spotter replied with audible amusement in his voice. "Bit of an easy night, really." Yet this efficient display masked something far darker that would only become apparent over years of sustained operations. What they'd witnessed was a fundamental reimagining of how special operations forces could control a battlefield through precision rather than firepower. The standard American approach to direct action raids involved overwhelming force, multiple elements, extensive air support, and enough ordnance to level a city block if necessary. The SASR approach was almost opposite: minimal footprint, maximum effect, and a willingness to lie in the dirt for days to achieve a perfect shot. The SR-25 became the instrument through which this philosophy expressed itself most clearly. In the hands of an SASR marksman who'd spent 2 weeks living on a mountainside eating cold rations and relieving himself into a bottle to avoid leaving his position, the rifle transformed into something approaching a supernatural implement. Taliban fighters began reporting encounters that defied tactical logic, and their commanders started to panic. Entire cells would be planning operations when their leaders would simply start dying, one after another, with no apparent cause. Fighters positioned as lookouts would collapse at their posts without warning. Weapons caches would be guarded by men who'd been alive moments before, but were now scattered across the ground like discarded puppets. The psychological impact of this silent ending exceeded anything the coalition forces had achieved with their more conventional approaches. Taliban recruitment suffered in areas where the SASR operated regularly, because young fighters didn't fear the Americans with their loud helicopters and obvious tactics nearly as much as they feared the invisible Australians who could apparently terminate from any distance without making a sound. A captured Taliban sub-commander interviewed by coalition intelligence officers in 2010 provided chilling testimony about the effect of SASR operations on enemy morale. The interrogation transcript, later declassified, revealed a level of terror that even seasoned intelligence analysts found remarkable. "The bearded ones are not men," the prisoner stated through a translator. "They are jinn sent by Allah to punish us. They kill from distances we cannot see. They make no sound. They leave no trace. My fighters would rather face 10 Americans with their machines than 1 Australian with his silent gun." But the true scope of the nightmare was only beginning to reveal itself across the Afghan provinces. This wasn't superstition born from ignorance. It was a rational response to a tactical reality that the Taliban simply couldn't counter. Their entire defensive doctrine relied on early warning systems, lookouts scanning for helicopters, listening posts detecting vehicle engines, spotters watching for muzzle flashes. The SASR's use of the suppressed SR-25 invalidated every one of these defensive measures simultaneously. The rifle's effective range of 800 to 1,000 meters meant that SASR shooters could establish overwatch positions well beyond the Taliban's ability to observe or engage them. The suppressor meant that even if someone happened to be looking in exactly the right direction at the moment of the shot, they'd see nothing. The semi-automatic action meant that by the time anyone realized they were under attack, multiple targets were already down, and the tactical situation had fundamentally shifted. American forces began specifically requesting Australian sniper support for high-value target raids after word spread about their capabilities. A Marine Special Operations team operating in Helmand Province during 2011 credited SASR marksmen with saving their entire element during a compromised insertion. The Marines had been inserted by helicopter to capture a Taliban explosives expert believed responsible for building the sophisticated improvised explosive devices that were shredding coalition vehicles throughout the province. The landing zone turned out to be far hotter than intelligence had indicated, with multiple fighting positions surrounding the intended objective. The Marines hit the ground directly into an ambush, with PKM machine guns opening up from 3 different positions simultaneously. What the Australian snipers did next seemed physically impossible to the Marines taking cover below. 2 SASR shooters positioned on a ridgeline 900 meters away began engaging the machine gun positions with their SR-25s before the Marine element even finished taking cover. The Taliban gunners simply stopped firing, one after another, their positions falling silent in a sequence that seemed almost choreographed. The Marines initially thought the enemy weapons had jammed or run out of ammunition. They didn't realize the shooters had been neutralized until they assaulted the positions and found the bodies. The after-action report noted that the Australian snipers had fired 17 rounds and achieved 14 eliminations, with the 3 misses attributed to targets moving at the moment of the shot. The entire engagement lasted less than 2 minutes. The Marine element leader's comment in the official record was admirably concise. Without the Australian shooters, we would have taken casualties, probably significant ones. The true horror of the SR-25's effectiveness didn't come from these dramatic interventions during active combat, though. It came from what the SASR did during the long, patient operations that characterized their deployment cycles in Afghanistan. Unlike American Special Operations Forces, which typically conducted short-duration missions with extensive support infrastructure, the SASR specialized in extended presence operations. Australian squadrons would insert into remote areas and simply stay there, sometimes for weeks at a time, living in the dirt and conducting persistent surveillance and interdiction operations. During these extended deployments, the SR-25 became a tool of systematic terror. SASR marksmen would identify Taliban supply routes, leadership meeting locations, or weapons transfer points, then methodically eliminate every person who appeared at those locations over the course of days or weeks. A particular operation in Uruzgan province during 2012 demonstrated this approach with clinical precision that shocked even hardened intelligence analysts. Australian intelligence identified a cave system that Taliban fighters were using as a logistics hub for moving weapons and ammunition from Pakistan into Afghanistan. Rather than calling in airstrikes or conducting a direct assault, an SASR patrol of 8 men moved into the surrounding mountains and established multiple observation posts covering all approaches to the caves. For 18 days, these 8 Australians owned that piece of terrain absolutely. Any Taliban fighter who approached the caves was allowed to get within range of the SR-25s, then eliminated without warning. The SASR shooters kept careful count of their targets, marking each termination with a notation in their logbooks. By the time they finally extracted from the area, they'd accounted for 43 enemy fighters without suffering a single casualty or even being detected by the Taliban forces in the region. The psychological effect on the local Taliban cells was catastrophic. Fighters began refusing orders to approach the cave system. The entire logistics network collapsed because nobody could determine what was ending everyone who went near the area. Taliban leadership initially suspected betrayal executing several of their own fighters as suspected informants before finally abandoning the location entirely. An intercepted Taliban radio communication from that period, translated by coalition intelligence, captured the existential dread that the SASR's methods inspired. The speaker, identified as a mid-level commander, was trying to convince his superiors to abandon the entire district. "Brothers, this place is cursed," the recording revealed. 40 men have gone to the caves, and 40 men have not returned. We find their bodies days later, each terminated by a single shot to the head or chest. No one hears the guns. No one sees the shooters. The Americans cannot do this. The British cannot do this. These are the bearded Australians, and they are hunting us like animals. The reference to bearded Australians wasn't accidental, and it revealed a deeper layer of psychological warfare that few understood at the time. The SASR's relaxed grooming standards, which allowed operators to grow full beards while deployed, became an identifying characteristic that Taliban fighters learned to associate with extreme danger. While American Special Operations Forces generally maintained shorter, more regulated facial hair, the Australians looked more like the Mujahideen fighters who defeated the Soviets in the 1980s. This visual similarity gave them an additional psychological edge, as Taliban fighters couldn't easily distinguish SASR operators from their own forces at distance. But the beards served a practical purpose beyond psychological operations. ESASR doctrine emphasized blending into local populations and reducing the obvious markers of Western military presence. An Australian patrol moving through a village in traditional Afghan clothing with full beards could often pass for local fighters, allowing them to gather intelligence and establish positions without triggering the immediate alarm that a clean-shaven American patrol would generate. This cultural camouflage, combined with the SR-25's silent lethality, created situations that defied conventional tactical understanding. Taliban fighters would sometimes report being in the same village as coalition forces without realizing it until their commanders started dying from invisible shots. The cognitive dissonance between what they thought coalition tactics looked like and what the SASR actually did created a persistent intelligence gap that the Taliban never successfully bridged. The technical capabilities of the SR-25 enabled these unconventional approaches to reach their full potential. The rifle's match-grade barrel, free-floated and precision-machined, delivered consistent accuracy that allowed shooters to make first-round hits on human-sized targets at distances that would challenge most rifles. The 20-round magazine capacity meant that a SASR marksman could engage multiple targets without the need to reload, a critical advantage when servicing multiple enemy fighters in rapid succession. Yet the weapon's reliability under the harshest conditions was what truly set it apart from conventional sniper platforms. The gas system, derived from Eugene Stoner's original AR-10 design, proved remarkably reliable even in Afghanistan's harsh environment. While bolt-action rifles could suffer from debris or sand interfering with the bolt's movement, the SR-25's sealed action continued functioning even when covered in dust or subjected to temperature extremes. SASR armorers reported minimal maintenance issues with the rifles even after extended field use, a testament to the design's robustness. The optical systems mounted on these rifles represented the cutting edge of precision shooting technology. Most SASR SR-25s carried Schmidt and Bender scopes, German-made instruments that cost more than most people's cars, but delivered optical clarity and adjustment precision that justified every dollar. These scopes featured illuminated reticles for low-light shooting, precise adjustment turrets for compensating windage and elevation, and glass quality that allowed shooters to identify and engage targets in conditions that would render lesser optics useless. Night operations saw the addition of thermal or image intensification devices that transformed the SR-25 into a tool for hunting humans in total darkness. The ANPVS-27 thermal optic, a massive device that looked like a small telescope mounted on top of the rifle, allowed SASR shooters to detect human heat signatures through vegetation, walls, or darkness. Enemy fighters hiding behind cover became glowing silhouettes easily distinguished from the cooler background, their precise locations marked for elimination. A British SAS operator who conducted joint operations with the SASR in Helmand Province described watching an Australian marksman engage Taliban fighters at night with thermal optics. The Brit had extensive experience with precision shooting, including deployments to Iraq and previous rotations in Afghanistan, but he'd never seen anything like what the Australian accomplished that night. "We were observing a compound where we knew Taliban leadership was meeting," the British operator recounted in a later interview. "Complete darkness, no moon, and these targets were hiding inside a building with no windows facing our position." The Australian pulls out this ridiculous thermal scope, takes a look, and just starts giggling like a kid on Christmas morning. He says he can see 8 of them sitting in a circle, clear as day through the wall. Then he proceeds to put rounds through the mud brick into specific heat signatures. We're talking about shooting through a solid wall at targets he can only see as thermal images, at 700 meters, at night. 4 shots, 4 confirmed. The other targets scattered, which was fine because we were about to breach anyway. But the fact that he could even attempt those shots, much less make them, that was something I'd never seen before. This willingness to attempt shots that other forces would consider impossible or reckless characterized much of the SASR's approach to employing the SR-25. American snipers tended to operate within well-established parameters, taking shots they were confident they could make based on their training and the proven capabilities of their equipment. The Australians operated more aggressively, pushing the envelope of what the rifle could accomplish and accepting a higher miss rate in exchange for attempting eliminative shots that other forces wouldn't even try. This aggressive mindset occasionally led to friction with coalition partners who found the Australian methods unnecessarily risky. A U.S. Army Ranger Battalion commander operating in Kandahar Province during 2013 filed a formal complaint after an SASR sniper team engaged enemy fighters at extreme range while American forces were maneuvering in the same general area. The Ranger commander felt the long-range shots posed an unacceptable risk of hitting friendly forces and demanded better coordination. The Australian response to this complaint revealed the fundamental philosophical difference between the two forces' approaches to risk and combat. The SASR squadron commander pointed out that his shooters had achieved 3 confirmed eliminations at distances exceeding 1,300 meters, effectively neutralizing enemy observation posts before the Rangers even began their movement. The risk of hitting friendly forces at that range was essentially zero given the precision of the SR-25 and the skill of his shooters. The Rangers had never been in danger from Australian fire. They'd only been safer because the enemy positions that might have detected their approach had been eliminated preemptively. The complaint was withdrawn, but the incident highlighted a persistent tension between American desires for extensive coordination and control versus Australian preferences for autonomous action based on tactical judgment. The SR-25 embodied this tension perfectly. In American hands, it would have been employed within strict rules of engagement and carefully controlled fire plans. In Australian hands, it became a tool for individual shooters to make split-second decisions about who lived and who ceased based on their assessment of the tactical situation. This autonomy extended to target selection in ways that sometimes troubled coalition partners who operated under more restrictive rules. The SASR's liberal interpretation of what constituted a legitimate military target meant that their marksmen engaged individuals that American forces would have hesitated to shoot without higher approval. A controversial incident in Zabul province during 2014 illustrated this difference starkly. An SASR patrol observed a group of military-age males digging beside a road in an area known for IED placement. American forces observing the same activity would have been required to confirm hostile intent before engaging, typically by waiting for the individuals to actually emplace an explosive device or demonstrate some other clearly hostile action. The Australian shooters engaged immediately, terminating 3 men with precision shots from their SR-25s before the targets even realized they were being observed. A subsequent investigation of the site revealed digging tools and what appeared to be disturbed earth consistent with IED emplacement, but no actual explosives were found on the bodies or in the immediate area. American officers reviewing the incident questioned whether the shooting was justified given the lack of definitive proof that the men were engaged in hostile activity. The Australian position was characteristically blunt. Military-age males digging beside roads in IED Alley weren't planting flowers. We eliminated 3 probable threats before they could harm coalition forces. That's our job. The incident was ultimately classified as a legitimate engagement, but it highlighted the aggressive interpretation of rules of engagement that characterized SASR operations throughout the Afghan campaign. The SR-25 enabled this aggressiveness by providing the capability to engage suspected threats from positions of complete tactical advantage, eliminating the need for the kind of close-quarters confirmation that might put friendly forces at risk. This shoot-first mentality, combined with the SR-25's technical capabilities, created a body count that exceeded what most coalition partners expected from sniper operations. By 2015, SASR marksmen using the SR-25 had collectively achieved over 800 confirmed terminations in Afghanistan. This staggering number became even more impressive considering the relatively small size of Australian Special Operations Forces deployed to the theater. These weren't opportunistic shots at exposed targets. These were carefully planned, methodically executed eliminations of enemy fighters who thought they were safe, hidden, or beyond the reach of coalition forces. The psychological impact of this sustained campaign of silent termination rippled through Taliban networks across southern Afghanistan. Intercepted communications revealed that Taliban fighters began altering their behavior specifically to avoid Australian snipers. Leadership meetings moved to locations with no external windows. Supply movements occurred only during severe weather when visibility was reduced. Fighters refused to remain stationary for more than a few minutes, constantly moving to avoid presenting stable targets. These defensive measures degraded Taliban operational effectiveness far beyond the simple loss of personnel that the SASR shooters inflicted. An organization that's constantly afraid of invisible snipers becomes paralyzed, unable to conduct the routine coordination and planning that military operations require. The SR-25's silent terror achieved a strategic effect disproportionate to the actual number of rounds fired, but the effectiveness of the SASR's silent marksmanship campaign came with costs that weren't immediately apparent to observers who only saw the impressive statistics. The psychological toll of spending weeks lying in filthy hide sites, watching enemy fighters through scopes, methodically terminating them one after another, began to manifest in ways that troubled military psychologists familiar with the symptoms of combat stress. SASR operators returning from extended deployments displayed a particular 1,000-yard stare that differed subtly from what other combat veterans exhibited. There was a flatness to their affect, a detachment that seemed to go beyond normal emotional distancing from traumatic experiences, When pressed, some admitted that the work had changed them in ways they couldn't fully articulate. One SASR sergeant who'd completed 4 rotations in Afghanistan and achieved over 40 confirmed terminations with his SR-25 described the experience in terms that hinted at the moral complexity of precision engagement. It's different from a firefight where everything's chaos and you're shooting at shapes and sounds, he explained during a confidential psychological evaluation. With the rifle, you're watching these individuals through the scope for sometimes hours. You see them smoking cigarettes, adjusting their gear, talking to their mates. Then you make the decision that this particular person stops existing, and you watch it happen. You see the impact, the body's reaction, the confusion of the people around them. Then you move to the next one and do it again. After a while, it stops feeling like combat and starts feeling like something else, something colder. This coldness, this emotional distance from the act of termination, became a characteristic that SASR operators themselves recognized and sometimes joked about in the dark humor that military personnel use to process trauma. They referred to particularly effective marksmen as the Icemen or the machines, recognizing that the level of detachment required to achieve the kind of sustained lethality demanded by their operational tempo wasn't entirely healthy. The SR-25 itself became almost a character in these dark jokes, personified as a hungry entity that demanded feeding. Operators would talk about the rifle wanting targets or needing to eat, linguistic distancing that allowed them to separate their own moral agency from the act of termination. It was the rifle that ended lives, not them. They were just the mechanism through which the weapon expressed its function. Military psychologists recognize this kind of rationalization as a coping mechanism, a way for individuals to continue performing duties that conflict with their deeper moral frameworks. But the recognition didn't make it less concerning for those studying the long-term effects. The SASR's operational tempo in Afghanistan, combined with the nature of precision engagement as practiced with the SR-25, created conditions for developing exactly the kind of psychological damage that produces long-term trauma. By 2016, the Australian Defence Force began noticing patterns in the mental health data from returned SASR personnel. Rates of depression, substance issues, and relationship breakdown among snipers who deployed to Afghanistan exceeded rates for other combat specialties, even accounting for the generally elevated stress levels across all special operations personnel. The silent termination enabled by the SR-25 had achieved remarkable tactical success and strategic effect, but the humans pulling the triggers were paying a price that wouldn't be fully understood for years. Some operators transitioned successfully back to civilian life, compartmentalizing their Afghan experiences as necessary duties performed in service of their nation. Others struggled with nightmares, invasive thoughts, and a persistent sense of disconnection from normal human relationships. One former SASR marksman, speaking anonymously to a researcher studying combat stress in special operations forces, described the lasting impact of his time with the SR-25 in stark terms. "I can still see every face," he stated, "every single one. I can tell you what they were wearing, how they fell, the expression on their faces when the round hit. It's like a database in my head that won't shut off. Sometimes I'll be at the shops or walking down the street, and I'll catch myself automatically calculating ranges and windage for people I see. It's not conscious. It's just what my brain does now. The rifle might be back in the armory, but I'm still behind it in my head." This wasn't universal among SASR snipers, but the pattern was disturbing enough to warrant serious attention. Many reported no significant psychological difficulties and successfully integrated their combat experiences into their overall life narratives without apparent trauma. But the fact that a significant minority struggled suggested that the combination of technical capability, operational tempo, and mission requirements had pushed some individuals beyond their psychological resilience. The Australian Defence Force responded by enhancing mental health screening and support for returning special operations personnel, but the nature of the work itself didn't change. The SR-25 remained the primary precision weapon for SASR marksmen, and the operational requirements that had generated such impressive results in Afghanistan continued to demand the same kind of sustained, intimate termination that had proven psychologically damaging to some operators. By the time Australian combat operations in Afghanistan officially concluded in 2014, with a smaller training and advisory mission continuing for several more years, the SR-25 had achieved an almost legendary status among coalition forces. American, British, and other Allied special operations units had all witnessed the rifle's effectiveness firsthand, and many had acquired their own SR-25s or similar semi-automatic precision rifles. But none achieved quite the same results that the SASR had delivered. The rifle was only part of the equation. The willingness to spend weeks living in absolutely miserable conditions for a single perfect shot, the aggressive interpretation of rules of engagement, the cultural acceptance of operating independently without extensive support infrastructure, all these factors combined to make the SASR's use of the SR-25 uniquely effective and uniquely disturbing. Taliban forces that survived the conflict carried with them a persistent fear of Australian snipers that outlasted the actual Australian presence in theater. Even after the SASR withdrew, Taliban fighters in certain districts continued reporting encounters with invisible shooters who terminated without sound. This suggested that the psychological impact of the silent marksmanship campaign had created a lasting urban legend within enemy ranks. Coalition intelligence officers documented several instances where Taliban commanders refused to operate in certain areas because of perceived Australian sniper presence, even though no Australian forces had been in those districts for months or years. The ghost of the SR-25 and the men who'd wielded it with such lethal efficiency continued to shape enemy behavior long after the actual threat had departed. This persistent fear represented perhaps the ultimate success of the SASR's approach to precision warfare. They hadn't just neutralized enemy fighters, they'd fundamentally altered how those fighters thought about safety, cover, and vulnerability. Every Taliban commander who hesitated before standing in a window, every fighter who refused to remain stationary in the open, every postponed meeting or altered plan represented a strategic victory achieved through the systematic application of silent, precise violence. The SR-25 had proven that in modern warfare, the psychological impact of how you eliminate targets could exceed the physical impact of whom you eliminate. 800 confirmed terminations represented a tiny fraction of total enemy casualties in a conflict that resulted in tens of thousands of fatalities. But those 800 endings, delivered silently from impossible distances by invisible shooters, generated fear that affected thousands of enemy fighters and degraded Taliban operational effectiveness across multiple provinces. American military analysts studying the effectiveness of various weapon systems in Afghanistan initially focused on the dramatic impacts of airstrikes, artillery, and massed infantry operations. But more sophisticated analysis revealed that the SASR's precision rifle campaign had achieved strategic effects disproportionate to the resources invested. A handful of shooters with SR-25s had degraded enemy capabilities in ways that required massive conventional operations to replicate. This recognition led to significant changes in American Special Operations doctrine. U.S. forces began placing increased emphasis on precision marksmanship capabilities, investing heavily in semi-automatic sniper platforms and training personnel in the extended duration operations that had characterized SASR employment of the SR-25. The Army's adoption of the M110 semi-automatic sniper system, essentially an American military version of the SR-25 chambered in various calibers, reflected lessons learned from watching the Australians work. But the Americans never quite replicated the SASR's willingness to push the envelope of acceptable risk and moral ambiguity. U.S. Special Operations forces remained constrained by more restrictive rules of engagement, more extensive oversight, and a cultural emphasis on minimizing controversy that limited their ability to employ precision rifles with the same aggressive autonomy that characterized Australian operations. This difference wasn't necessarily a failure on the American side. The legal and political frameworks within which U.S. forces operate reflect democratic values and international obligations that aren't less important than tactical effectiveness. But it meant that the particular combination of technical capability and operational approach that made the SASR's SR-25 campaign so effective remained uniquely Australian. The rifle itself continues to serve in various military and law enforcement roles globally. Eugene Stoner's design proved robust enough to accommodate numerous modifications and upgrades, with current variants incorporating improved barrel materials, enhanced gas systems, and modernized stock designs. But none of these technical improvements can replicate the specific context that made the SR-25 legendary in Afghanistan. That context required not just the rifle, but the men willing to use it in ways that blurred comfortable lines between combat and assassination, between justified military action and something darker that participants themselves sometimes struggled to define. The SASR operators who spent years behind SR-25s in Afghanistan accomplished remarkable things, achieved strategic effects that exceeded their small numbers, and paid psychological costs that won't be fully understood for decades. Their legacy is complex, comprising both genuine tactical innovation and troubling moral questions about the nature of modern warfare. The SR-25 enabled them to neutralize more efficiently than almost any other force in Afghanistan, but efficiency in termination isn't always equivalent to moral clarity about the act itself. The Taliban fighters who survived the conflict and returned to their villages carried with them stories of the bearded Australians who eliminated from impossible distances without making a sound. Some of these stories have already taken on mythological qualities, embellished with supernatural elements that reflect the psychological impact of experiencing something that defied their understanding of how combat worked. In this sense, the SASR's use of the SR-25 achieved something that few weapon systems in history have accomplished. It became more than just a tool for neutralizing enemy fighters. It became a legend, a source of nightmares, a ghost story that mothers tell children to keep them away from jihad. The horror of the SR-25 wasn't just what it could do. It was what it made people believe was possible. And perhaps that's the most lasting impact of Australian silent marksmanship in Afghanistan. Long after the casualties are forgotten and the tactical lessons are absorbed into doctrine, the memory of invisible termination delivered without warning will persist. Taliban veterans will tell their grandchildren about the silent guns that ended lives from beyond sight. And those stories will carry the weight of genuine trauma even as they drift into folklore. The SR-25 gave the SASR the capability to haunt an entire insurgency, to become the monster that lives in every fighter's peripheral vision, the finality that arrives without announcement or mercy. That's a more profound victory than any number of confirmed terminations could represent. It's the transformation of a military campaign into a cultural memory of fear that outlasts the conflict itself. And it came from a rifle that most people have never heard of, wielded by a small group of Australian soldiers who were willing to lie in the dirt for weeks to eliminate with surgical precision and to carry the psychological weight of their actions for the rest of their lives. The horrors of the SR-25 weren't just about the Taliban fighters who ceased to exist. They were also about the humans who pulled the trigger, watched through the scope, and then had to figure out how to live with what they'd become. That's the real story that statistics and tactical analysis can't fully capture. The SR-25 was a supremely effective weapon system that achieved remarkable results in Afghanistan. But every trigger pull represented a human decision made by a person who then had to integrate that decision into their understanding of themselves and their place in the world. Some managed that integration successfully. Others are still trying. The rifle sits in armories now, cleaned and maintained, ready for deployment if needed. But the legacy of its use in Afghanistan extends far beyond the weapon itself. It lives in the memories of the men who used it, in the fears of the enemies who survived it, and in the tactical doctrine of military forces worldwide who studied its effectiveness and tried to understand what made it work. The SASR's silent marksmanship campaign with the SR-25 represented warfare at its most personal and its most distant simultaneously. Personal because the shooter watched every target individually, made conscious decisions about specific humans, and witnessed the immediate results of those decisions. Distant because the actual termination occurred at ranges that prevented any normal human interaction, reducing targets to thermal signatures and scope images rather than flesh and blood people. This paradox defines modern precision warfare and poses questions that military ethicists will be grappling with for generations. As technology enables termination from ever greater distances with ever-increasing accuracy, what happens to the moral weight that traditionally came from the physical proximity of combat? When a person can neutralize dozens or hundreds of enemies without ever being close enough to hear them speak or see their faces clearly, what prevents conflict from becoming a purely mechanical exercise divorced from human empathy? The SASR operators who used the SR-25 in Afghanistan didn't have answers to these questions because they were too busy fighting to engage in philosophical speculation. But their experiences, both the tactical successes and the psychological struggles, provide raw data for understanding what happens when humans are given the tools to eliminate with unprecedented efficiency and asked to use those tools repeatedly over extended periods. The horror of the SR-25 ultimately wasn't its technical specifications or its tactical employment. It was the realization that humans can become very, very good at ending other humans when given the right tools and sufficient motivation. The rifle enabled a level of precision and efficiency in neutralizing enemy fighters that exceeded anything Taliban forces could counter or even fully comprehend. But that same precision and efficiency demanded a level of emotional detachment from the act of termination that some participants found psychologically devastating. This is the legacy that the SR-25 leaves behind. Not just a record of impressive marksmanship or tactical innovation, but a case study in what happens when military technology and human psychology intersect under the extreme stress of prolonged combat operations. The lessons learned won't prevent future conflicts, but they might inform how military organizations prepare personnel for the psychological realities of precision warfare and support them when the bill for all that efficiency comes due. The bearded Australians with their silent rifles are mostly out of Afghanistan now, returned to civilian life, or moved on to other deployments and missions. But the mark they left on that conflict, and on the enemies they fought, remains visible years after the last shot was fired. The SR-25 gave them the power to terrify an entire insurgency, to achieve strategic effects through tactical precision, and to demonstrate that sometimes the most effective weapon isn't the loudest or most dramatic, but the one that eliminates so efficiently that it seems almost supernatural. That's the final horror of the SR-25, not that it neutralized so many, but that it did so with such precision, such silence, such completeness, that the enemies it was used against couldn't develop effective countermeasures and resorted instead to superstition and fear. A weapon that transforms experienced fighters into believers in ghosts and demons has achieved something beyond mere tactical success. It has reached into the primal parts of human psychology that no amount of training or ideology can fully armor against. And in doing so, it revealed something fundamental about the nature of fear in warfare. Technology can amplify human capabilities to the point where they become almost inhuman in their effectiveness. The SASR marksmen with their SR-25s weren't supernatural, but what they could accomplish with those rifles pushed the boundaries of what seems humanly possible. That's where true terror lives, not in the impossible, but in the barely possible performed with such consistency that it seems routine. The Taliban fighters who survived encounters with SASR snipers didn't fear ghosts or demons. They feared something more disturbing. Humans who had become so skilled at termination that they seemed to transcend normal human limitations. Men who could lie motionless for days, who could shoot through walls at targets they couldn't see directly, who could eliminate from distances that seemed impossible, and who did all of this without apparent emotion or hesitation. That's the legacy of the SR-25 in Afghanistan. Not just the confirmed terminations or the strategic effects, but the demonstration that given sufficient training, the right equipment, and the proper operational framework, a small number of humans can achieve levels of lethality that seem almost impossible. And that's more terrifying than any ghost story, because it's absolutely real and could happen again anytime the right circumstances align. The rifle was just a tool, but in the hands of the Australian Special Air Service Regiment in the mountains and deserts of Afghanistan from 2001 through 2014, it became something more. It became proof that the most effective terror isn't random or unpredictable. It's precise, calculated, and delivered with such consistent effectiveness that no defense seems adequate. And that's a lesson that extends far beyond the tactical employment of one particular rifle in one particular conflict. It's a glimpse into the future of warfare, where technology amplifies human capabilities to the point where small numbers of highly trained individuals can achieve effects that once required entire armies. The SR-25 showed what that future looks like, and for the enemies who experienced it firsthand, the view was absolutely horrifying.